Summer, 1934. Folku Bergman was crossing the Taklamakan, a desert so brutal that its name means, you go in and you don't come out. A local hunter named Urdek had led him here. Years earlier, Urdek had found something he could not explain. After days of walking through nothing but sand, they reached a strange sight on the horizon. Dozens of wooden posts jutting out of the desert, like the remains of a shipwreck, but there was no water for hundreds of kilometers. The locals called it the Cemetery of 1,000 Coffins. Bergman dug one of the boat-shaped coffins out of the sand. Inside, a body, not a skeleton, a fully preserved human being. Reddish-brown hair, high cheekbones, skin still intact, and clothing made from a fabric that looked impossible, like tartan. He had discovered the Xiaohe cemetery, a burial ground over 4,000 years old. And the people inside? They did not look like they belonged in China. What do you call mummies that look European, buried in the heart of Asia, thousands of years before any recorded contact between East and West? That question haunted archaeologists for nearly a century. Welcome to Mosaic Antiquity. For decades, the only answer was speculation. Some said they were lost Scythian warriors. Others claimed they were Indo-European migrants who crossed the mountains and got stranded. A few whispered they were the descendants of Alexander the Great's army, even though Alexander lived 2,000 years too late. The mummies themselves offered no easy answers. Found in the Tarim Basin, a vast desert in modern-day Xinjiang, China. The climate is so dry that bodies buried here do not decompose. They desiccate naturally, like freeze-dried time capsules. Some were buried in boat-shaped coffins, as if preparing for a journey across the afterlife. Others lay wrapped in ox hide, sealed airtight. The most famous of them, the woman archaeologists call the Princess of Xiaohe, still has her eyelashes intact. Her lips are slightly parted as if she is about to speak. But her face is not Chinese, not typically East Asian. She has long, light brown hair, a prominent nose, features that look more like someone you would meet in Ireland than in Inner Asia. And her clothes, a woolen cloak with a twill weave, the same diagonal pattern found in Bronze Age salt mines in Austria, a hat made of felt, leather boots. She looked like she belonged in the European Bronze Age. So for decades, the textbook said, these people were migrants from the West, probably early Indo-Europeans, a branch of a group that somehow ended up trapped in the desert. It made sense. It seemed logical. There was only one problem. It was completely wrong. When the evidence arrived, it did not just challenge the theory, it shattered it. In 2021, an international team, scientists from Jilin University in China and the Max Planck Institute in Germany, published a study in Nature. They sequenced the DNA of the earliest Tarim mummies, 13 individuals who lived between 2135 and 1623 BCE. The results stopped the archaeological world cold. If these people were European migrants, their DNA should show a clear trail. It should look like the steppe herders who swept into Europe around the same time, or at least like populations from Central Asia. It did not. The early Tarim mummies had around 72% ancient North Eurasian ancestry, a lineage that once stretched from Siberia to Europe, now nearly extinct. The other 28% came from ancient Northeast Asians, ancestors of modern Siberian populations. And here is the part that rewrites everything. They had almost zero Western steppe ancestry. None of the genetic markers that define the Indo-European migrations. They were not outsiders who arrived from somewhere else. They were the descendants of a population that had been living in the region since the end of the last ice age. A genetically isolated group that stayed put while empires rose and fell around them. This is where the story turns. The Tarim mummies were not lost Europeans. They were the last survivors of an ancient lineage, a people scientists call ancient North Eurasians. For context, this is the same population that contributed DNA to modern Europeans, Native Americans, and Siberians, but those groups mixed with other populations over thousands of years. The people of Xiaohe did not mix. They stayed in the Tarim Basin and remained genetically isolated for millennia. So how did they end up looking European? Because the ancient North Eurasian lineage itself carried traits that we now associate with Europeans: light hair, light eyes, prominent facial features. These traits did not come from Europe. They predate Europe. They are remnants of a shared ancestry that goes back over 20,000 years. The Tarim mummies did not wander into Asia from the West. They were already there. They were the ones who stayed home. But if they were isolated, how did they survive in one of the harshest deserts on Earth? The answer: they adapted brilliantly. The Tarim mummies were agro-pastoral. They herded cattle, sheep, and goats. They grew wheat and millet, crops that originated in completely different parts of the world. Wheat from the Middle East, millet from East Asia. The Xiaohe people stood at the crossroads, not as migrants, but as a hub. They did not need to move. Trade came to them. And they knew something we are still learning today. Ephedra branches, a plant still used in traditional medicine across Asia, were found placed on the chests of many mummies, likely for healing or ritual purposes. These people understood their environment intimately. They were not struggling to survive. They were thriving. At another Tarim site, archaeologists found something heartbreaking. A baby about 1 year old buried over 3,000 years ago. 2 small stones placed carefully over his eyes. A red and blue felt cap still on his head. His remains so perfectly preserved that you can still see his eyelashes. This was not a civilization that was lost. It was a civilization that lived, loved, and died, right where they had always been. So here's the question this leaves us with. The traditional story says, civilization started in a few places, Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, and spread outward. The Silk Road came later, connecting east and west for the first time. The mummies of Xiaohe prove that story was never quite right. The east and west were already connected 4,000 years ago. Ideas, crops, and technologies were flowing across the continent long before the first official trade route. And more than that, there is no single, pure origin for any civilization. The people of Xiaohe looked European, but they were not European. They lived in what is now China, but their DNA does not match modern Chinese. They were themselves, a unique branch on the human family tree that flourished in the desert, and then, for reasons we still do not fully understand, simply faded away. In 1934, Folke Bergman opened a coffin in the middle of a desert and found a face from 4,000 years ago. He took careful notes. He photographed everything. Then he packed up and left the Xiaohe cemetery to the sand. For decades, the site was lost again. The desert swallowed it. It was not until the early 2000s that Chinese archaeologists rediscovered it, using GPS coordinates from Bergman's journals. Today, we have DNA sequencers and carbon dating and the collective knowledge of generations of scientists. We finally know who these people were. But the question Bergman asked when he first saw that face, the question every visitor still asks, is the same one. Who were you? The answer, it turns out, is more incredible than anyone imagined. They were not migrants. They were not wanderers. They were home. And their story proves something we are only beginning to understand. Human history has no single center. It has many, and some of them are buried in places we least expect. Next time. Next to the Great Pyramid of Giza, there's a hole in the ground. 30 meters down, a sealed coffin in black water. The pyramids were already ancient when this was built. No name, no entrance. Water that never drains. Who lies inside? Why hide it? Subscribe to Mosaic Antiquity. We'll see you there.